I think that's key for writing a really good, compelling villain is finding personality traits or aspects or things that are unexpected in a villain that really can take a villain from sufficient elevates it to the next level is when that character becomes something that is really unexpected that you just don't expect to see in a villain. Like you don't expect to see compassion, or you don't expect to see humor, or you don't expect to see that playfulness, or whatever the thing is.
Yeah.
I think that can really elevate.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indy Author podcast, I talk with Greta Boris about constructing a multi-layered villain, including how analyzing villains in our previous works can help us understand what does and doesn't work with readers, and how characters' personalities, based on tools like Enneagram, influence their effectiveness as villains. We also explore examples of well-crafted villains from TV shows like Breaking Bad and movies like The Silence of the Lambs. Greta shares insight from her personal writing process and touches on the challenges and nuances of writing morally complex villains. And a quick request before we get to the interview: if you have gotten value from the podcast, please leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform to help others find it. And now let's hear from Greta Boris about constructing a multi-layered villain. Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author podcast. Today, my guest is Greta Boris. Hey, Greta, how are you doing?
Hi, Matty.
It is lovely to have you back. You were a many, many time guest. But just in case people need a little reminder of your many accomplishments, Greta Boris is the USA Today bestselling author of the Mortician Murders, a ghostly mystery series, and the soon-to-be-released almost true crime thriller series. She's also co-creator of the Author Wheel, producers of books, courses, and a podcast dedicated to helping writers overcome their roadblocks. And I invited Greta back to the podcast because a couple of weeks ago, I went to a writers' conference and I heard a great presentation on villain. And I was like, oh, I want to talk with someone about villains. So I put the word out, and Greta said, oh, I'd like to talk about villains too.
I
So that's
love
going
villain.
I love villains too. I think this is going to be so much fun. And one of the things that you had proposed we talk about is looking back at an old series. So I thought that might be a fun place to start when you're thinking about villains in the context of looking back at an old series. What were your thoughts there?
Well, so the almost true crime series it's coming out. The first book's coming out in August, is actually a reimagining of my originally published series, the Seven Deadly Sins series. And one of the things that made that original series difficult to sell, which I'm hoping that we're fixing in this new version, because it does have a character that repeats in every book, but the original version did not. Every book had a different cast of characters. So some of them would interact with each other. It was a world, but it was not, it had different protagonists and consequently a different villain for each. So looking back at that series was really interesting for me to see, like, which of those villains really worked, because now it was like a long time since I'd written them. So it's almost like I'm looking at somebody else's books. Which of those villains worked? Which of those villains needed, a little haircut and sprucing up, and why? Like, what made them work and what didn't? And from that distance, what I did get to see is that, and this is sort of another segueing potentially into another topic, is that the villains that were sort of the yin to the yang of my main character really worked well. So if my main character was like, I like to use the Enneagram for creating my character. So if my main character, say, was an achiever and she was very motivated and she was going to, sell, sell, or do her career to the utmost, that the villain also was an achiever. He just was not a nice one and willing to cross a lot more lines to get what he wanted than, say, my main character, who was still struggling with having some kind of character and some kind of like morality or ethics in a situation where the villain would throw those ethics to the wind and do what she really wanted to do, but wasn't going to let herself. So it was interesting to see that tension.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that episode 181 is Claire Taylor talking about Enneagram for your author career, but she also talks a little bit about giving background on Enneagram if anyone is not familiar with that.
Yeah, I like to play with the idea that if you have your protagonist kind of deliberating over what they're willing to do to get what they want, and then the villain goes ahead and does everything the protagonist decides they wouldn't do, and it's just fun.
It is interesting in stories where there's a point where the protagonist is becoming more like the villain and then has to make that moral decision, and they choose the high road where the villain is choosing the low road.
Yes, that's a
Did
good
you
way to say it.
did you find that when you look back across those 7 books, which is a great testing ground for villains, was that usually the thing that defined whether you felt the villain was effective in each, the degree to which their personality type and the protagonist's personality type were similar on a surface level?
Not necessarily, although I did do that quite a bit because my original vision for those stories, the 7 Deadly Sins, is each book had its own sin. So I wanted a lot of the characters to struggle with that concept, whatever it was.
Mm.
But there were a few where they were very different personality types, and that can work too, where they're almost clashing personality types. And so they don't even understand like and that can put the protagonist really on her back foot because if she doesn't even think that way at all, the way that the villain thinks, then she's even more surprised by whatever the villain does because it would never occur to her to do those things. So that can bring in a nice element of shock and surprise to the main character because that's something I really try to avoid, and hopefully readers of my books will say I do. But I really try to avoid that thing where you're reading a book and then all of a sudden the main character is so stupid, like she deserves whatever the villain does to her. So constantly coming up with a new way for her to be surprised or for whatever your main character is to be surprised is a whole nother challenge. So yeah, one way to play with it is same personality where they're kind of thinking similar, but one will do it and one will not, the evil thing or whatever. And then another way is again clashing personality types where it would never even occur to the main character to do the thing that the evil one is doing.
What is a book or movie that people would be familiar with where you felt that the villain was particularly compelling?
Well, Breaking Bad, I mean, that is you're watching the making of a villain over how many seasons, right?
Yeah.
Because when he begins, we are all sympathetic to him. I mean, he's got a pregnant wife, he's got a kid with physical challenges, and he needs money for his family. But then as we watch him go down that road and become less and less altruistic, the reason for what he wants, and more just to assuage his own ego and to get revenge on people. And all of a sudden, he's worse than the drug lords who were his villains in the beginning. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of an obvious one in the making of a villain. But I do think that that's an important, if you don't want your villains to be Voldemort, I mean, he was a great villain. There's no question about it. But in the beginning, he is almost like a cartoon character or like many of the villains in the Marvel world. They're very comic book esque because that's where they came from. And they don't have a ton of backstory until uh, gradually, I think writers have been writing in more backstory for them so that you have some sympathy. But if you don't want your villain to be that two-dimensional, almost clown-like figure, you do have to give them some kind of, I don't know if you don't have to make them sympathetic, but you have to make their world make sense to them, so that their actions are making sense within the parameters of their world. And that's always a challenge because hopefully most of the writers we know are not actually psychopaths. So to write a psychopath, you kind of gotta do a lot of research.
Yeah. Well, and psychopath makes me think of, I think the classic example that people bring up quite rightly is Hannibal Lecter.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I'm going to use the movie version because I've seen the movie more recently than I've read the book. But I think that Hannibal Lecter is a compelling villain because he's both awful and he's, as portrayed in the movie, can be charming,
Mm.
intelligent, resourceful. And if he had no redeeming qualities, I can't imagine that would have been as interesting a movie as it was. And I guess that in the later books, I haven't read the later books that I think were like prequels to The Silence of the Lambs, but I believe that Thomas Harris gave the backstory so that later on you did have more empathy for what had happened that made this person the psychopath that he was.
Yeah. I saw the movie, but the books were too gritty for me. But in real life, the most successful psychopathic murderers weren't charming, most of them. You know, Ted Bundy, I have a woman that I know. She wrote one of the original, a long time ago when Ted Bundy was first caught and, the whole story came out. She wrote a biography on him, one of the original biographies. And she told me this story that just, I like want to replicate this story in fiction in some ways because it's so, so creepy. Um, and she had a woman that she interviewed knew Ted Bundy well. And I think he would come into their office as a vendor or a representative of another company. So she saw him pretty frequently. And one time he was in her office, and so was her daughter, who was about 2019, 20 years old. And they were talking about these murders that were happening that were so terrifying. And Ted Bundy was the murderer, but nobody knew it at that point. And so he was commiserating with them that it was scary and it was getting dark out and the daughter needed to leave. And Ted Bundy offered to walk her to her car, and the mom thanked him dearly. And Ted Bundy walked her daughter to her car because they were also afraid of these murderers. And and then when it all came out who the murderer was, can you imagine how you would feel as a mother? But it's
Yeah.
terrifying. But I think that idea that you can get your characters to maybe like and trust, that's more thriller-esque than mystery, that you could get your characters to like and trust this person who is so dangerous, and the audience or the readership knows that he's dangerous. And yet these characters are going. So like one, I've tried to like mill that story, as much as I could. But the seventh book in the Almost True Crime series is kind of a home invasion story. And it does start with somebody allowing somebody in. They allow in, and the readers know that this is not the person you want to allow in. And yet he's allowed in this terrible weather. And so there's, extenuating circumstances, but he has no idea who this guy really is. But in real life, you do hear about that happening a lot, that a man is, and it's usually men, sorry, men, particularly charming and knows how to get people to trust him.
It is an interesting distinction about writing mystery versus writing a thriller because with a thriller, I think the assumption would be that people know who the bad guy is. Whereas with a mystery, you have a villain in that you have a murderer, but you can't be overt about who it is until the reveal. And so I think the lesson there is if you're writing mystery, you have to give each character certain villainous characteristics and certain positive characteristics to keep everybody, all the people that you want to queue up as suspects in the running.
Yeah,
Um,
your red herrings have to,
yeah.
yeah.
And I like that idea because when you're thinking about who you're setting up, who the real bad guy is and how to set up the other people, I think you similarly wouldn't want to give people villainous characteristics just to give them villainous characteristics. I think you'd really have to think about why is the person being the way they're being.
Yeah, motives are huge. And guy, my first few books, they had the editor that my publisher was using. She was also a creative writing instructor at the college level. So it was great because I was getting, it's like I had a college professor going over all my manuscripts and stuff. And motive was always what I was getting my hand slapped for. And I think that is a common mistake of newer writers is to just go, well, he's a nut. Like he's a
Yeah.
psycho. Why do I need more motive than that? Well, you do,
Yeah.
because people need to understand why they're doing what they're doing, even as you said before, even if it's just in their own world that makes sense to them and
Yeah.
doesn't make sense to anybody else, but at least in their world, it makes sense to them. I did think about it before we started talking about it, but it is really true that a villain in a thriller is distinct, even if you do have the mystery element, like who exactly is this villain, you're usually, because like in all of mine, I have a first person character, which is often the villain or one of the villains in that series, the Almost True Crime series, but you don't know who that first person character is. So there is a mystery element, but yet the reader is getting a lot of this person's character and a lot of this person's viewpoint. So they have a very good idea what makes this person tick and what are they thinking and what are they doing behind the scenes, even if they are not sure if it's character A, B, or C.
Yeah, I realized that in the Enneagram books, the people who are the bad guys are mainly people who are not intrinsically bad and are going out, with a goal of making life miserable for other people, but they're like normal people who make one bad decision and then keep making more and more bad decisions. And, the bad decisions lead them down a path that's very far from the path they might have chosen for themselves. Which I think I enjoy reading characters like that because I think it's much more easy for me as the reader to put myself in their position like, "Oh, I can see how I might have made that first bad decision that led them so far astray."
Yeah,
Uh,
it's the
yeah,
domino effect, right? And that's a Breaking Bad. I mean, I think that's why it
yeah,
captured us, like most of the country by the nose and let them down however many seasons, because it was like, could that be me?
yeah,
Could I have done something like that? It's very much the domino effect. Thank you. In my Mortician series, which is much more murder mystery, by about, well, I guess he came in the novella between books one and book two, but then I decided he was going to become the arch villain by about book two or three. I just had to have that kind of villain. I guess because I'd written so many thrillers. So there's always a villain in each villain or two, whatever, in each story who committed the murders, who needs to get caught. But then I have this arch villain who sort of hovers in the background of every book. And the last few books, we're going to, he's her Voldemort. We're going to go and tackle him and have a big grand battle and it'll be all fun. I haven't figured out exactly what's going to happen yet, but that's an interesting thing too, is like an arch villain versus just a villain who only needs to be a villain for one story.
yeah. Yeah, the example for me would be that in the Lizzie Ballard books, there is one book with a character in it who is he's just a psychopath. And I intentionally didn't want to give him any sort of redeeming qualities except for a sort of Ted Bundy-esque surface charmingness, because he was there basically to present the protagonist with a difficult moral dilemma that she had to resolve. He's kind of more of a plot mechanism. But
Yeah.
the villain of the first book, whose name is Louise Mortensen, she is the medical doctor who is responsible for the extraordinary ability that Lizzie Ballard has. And when I wrote that first book, not only did I not know that it was going to be a series, but I definitely didn't know that Louise was going to capture my interest and that she would become a continuing character. So she's definitely Lizzie's nemesis, but she's Lizzie's nemesis because she's a person who feels the end justifies the means. And so as a scientist, she has scientific goals and she's willing to knock off some people in her pursuit of the goals. So she never does anything because she wants to be cruel. She does things she does despite the fact that she realizes it's going to be cruel. And in one of the recent books, I had a scene where she comes upon someone who, in other circumstances, would be her enemy. And he's tied up and he's in bad shape. And she unties him so he can treat himself. And when he's done that, he says, "Why did you do that? Why did you untie me?" And she said, "Well, why wouldn't I? There was no point in leaving you tied up." So she's evil in the context of the story because she believes the ends justify the means, but she can do graceful things, but she's not doing them because she's a good person. She's doing them because it's the practical thing to do. And I actually
Mm,
just found that really fascinating. I found it so fascinating that I wrote a novella that had her as the protagonist.
fun.
Yeah, it was super fun, thereby requiring that there be a worse antagonist, a worse villain.
Yeah.
And in each story, her position kind of changes. Like, she's kind of the Lady Macbeth of the first story. And with each book, her position kind of changes. Like, in one of the books, she is at the mercy of the worst bad guy, and there's a scene where she's trying to get away. And I hope that the reader's rooting for her, because at that moment, she's the person she is the lesser of the two evils. She's the person you want to win, but then in other circumstances, no, you kind of hope that she gets hit by a car.
So I have a question for you. When you go to write your books, what comes first, the crime or the criminal? I guess that's my question. Like, do you develop, and maybe this is something listeners can think about too. Do we develop a villain to fit the crime, or do we develop a crime to fit the villain?
Do you have an answer that you'd like to share while I'm thinking about my answer to it?
Sure. Well, I think I've done it both ways. I think sometimes if there is a crime that just comes in like I've read about something in the paper or I've heard about, so for instance, I heard about a true crime that happened where this family, their son, who was in his 20s or 30s, he was a grown man. They hadn't seen him for a very long time, but they were getting text messages from him, and that he had gone to Cabo or someplace and he'd have a picture of him with his girlfriend or a picture of this woman that he said, "Oh, I know this is so irresponsible, but I went on a vacation with this woman. I fell in love with her. And here's a picture of her on our sailboat." And he was texting them regularly, so they weren't worried about it. And then somewhere like a year after this, somehow or another, they discovered that no, he was dead, and he had been dead the whole time. So then it became who was sending the text messages and why. And so I kind of played off that for one of the books that I wrote. It's not exactly the same, but I kind of played off that idea. And in that case, I definitely had the crime before the villain. And then, well, what kind of villain would think up something like that? And why would they do that? And, so then I created a villain to fit the crime in that case. But other times it's been the other way around. I've got the idea for a villain and it's like, well, what would they do? What kind of, put yourself in their head. How would they react to X, Y, or Z? Anyway, just a different way to look at things.
Yeah. Well, for that same question for the Louise Mortensen character, in the first one, it was definitely I needed a character to fit the crime. So the crime in this case was the woman who ran a fertility clinic was running unauthorized experiments on her patients. So I knew it was going to be a medical doctor. But then as the story went along and Louise became a more fully fleshed out character to me, I think a lot of the story was triggered by me thinking, well, this has happened to Louise. How is Louise going to respond to it? It wasn't that
Mm.
after the first book, I had a preconceived idea of what the whole rest of the story arc was going to be or the series arc was going to be. It was that, okay, well, now Louise has gotten herself in this jam. And what is she going to do to get out of it? Oh, it makes sense that she would do this. Oh, and you know what? That causes real problems for Lizzie because of such and such. I think that for the Anne Kinnear books, which are more suspense and mystery than thriller, I had an idea of the plot, and then I needed a character who would step into that role And they became more real to me as I wrote about them, and I understood more of their motivation about why they did a certain thing and what steps would they take. And sometimes I would say, okay, well, I thought that the character would do this in this circumstance, but now I feel like I know them better and they would not do that. So now I have to rethink the plot. So yeah, a little bit of back and forth.
Yeah, I had a character, a villain that I was writing along, and I got about 3/4 of the way through the book, maybe. And this is one where in the Almost True Crime series where he has first person chapters from his perspective. So I'm really closely in his head, which is always scary to be in the head of your villain that closely. But anyway, so I'm in his head, and all of a sudden I realize that he's totally OCD. I didn't see that before. Like, but he's OCD, and he's got a little rituals and things that he counts, and things that when he sees certain things that trigger him to believe that, oh, okay, now I should do this thing. Or, he's got his superstitions and his rituals and all that kind of thing. I had to go back and rewrite all his parts because I realized that I had thought back to the Enneagram, I had thought he was a certain Enneagram personality. But when you go dark on that personality type, they're not OCD. They would never be OCD. They would have other psychopathies or, emotional or whatever upsets, but that would not be one of them. And so I had to find the personality types that when they fractured, when they broke, they did become OCD, and then back them out a little bit to where they were slightly healthier and fix him and make him that personality type, and then watch it go down and go down and, watch him break bad, so to speak. I mean, he was never a good guy. It opens with him escaping from prison, but yeah, but to watch him get worse, and how would that personality kind of disintegrate or fall apart?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I especially in my Almost True Crime series that's coming out, I do that a lot. My biological father was a psychotherapist. My sister is a doctor of psychology. And I think I just got it in my blood. Like, I'm just fascinated with what makes people tick and why they do what they do. So I
Yeah.
love playing with all those different personalities. And it's hard to do these days without. So this is something we could think about too. Like, when you create a villain, you always run the risk of offending somebody, right? Because putting people into a box of a person who is psychologically has a certain psychological problem. And yes, the vast number of even psychopaths never kill anybody. The
Right.
vast number are presidents of corporations or policemen or whatever,
Yeah.
they just are warriors. They just have the ability to shut down empathy and do their job and do a hard job in a hard place. And we'd kind of be lost without them, especially in times of war and that kind of thing. But then there's always that segment that get really broken,
Yeah.
and they have that particular personality genetic trait, and watch out, you know?
Yeah, I think that's why it's so important to have the villain be a well-rounded character, because if the person is kind of a caricature of someone who suffers from OCD, then that's different than someone who for whom that is one aspect of their personality,
Yeah.
and it's not necessarily the aspect on which you're basing the bad things they've done. It's a
Right.
characteristic, it's not the cause.
Yes, exactly. Like, he does go into a lot of memories of his childhood, which was horrible. And that kind of explain how he got the way that he is. And there's a million people who have OCD who are lovely people and would never commit crimes. But people who commit horrendous crimes are broken in some way. So it's a fine line as a mystery thriller writer, because we're basically exploring human brokenness. Even in the funny, cozy mysteries, somebody killed somebody,
Yeah.
right? People who are really emotionally well and whole don't usually kill people, eh, you know, unless it's self defense or something. So it's tricky.
Well, one of the things that I struggle with more with the Lizzie Ballard stories than I do with the and Canary ones is that there's much more moral ambiguity in the Lizzie Ballard books. And so I'm always trying to look for opportunities to find out from people what their response has been to particular characters. So Louise. So I'm always looking for people to write reviews of the novella I wrote about Louise, which is called Killbox Checkmate, because I wanted, I find Louise fascinating. And she's somebody I love spending time with. Let's put it that way. Spending time with on the page, partially because, there's probably a little bit of Louise in me in the sense that I'm sure that there's an aspect of the ends justify the means at a less psychopathic level in my own
Well,
life.
I
But
I would hope so.
yeah, well, I think it's true of everybody, but I found that interesting to explore. And then I've also had characters who are very clearly uh, the good guys, the people who are the stalwart supporters of the protagonist do some things that are somewhat morally questionable. And I enjoy reading that. I think that makes for a more interesting story. It was very interesting. I'm trying to think of a way to say this without having it be a spoiler. So the character, so Lizzie Ballard in most of the books is 16, 17 years old. And there was a male character who is, let's say, 40. And I had a scene where Lizzie shows up. She's dressed up as she's dressing up so that she can pass for 21. So she shows up like normally she wears, jeans and flip flops but she has makeup on. She has like a kind of a form fitting dress on. She's wearing high heels, she's all dressed up. And I had this person who's a friend of hers, in a kind of parental role, have this moment of reacting to her as he would if he were just walking down the street and he saw a very good looking woman of his own age walk by. And one of my beta readers really had an issue with that because she said it's gross that this 40-year-old man's having this reaction to a 17-year-old young woman. Not being a 40-year-old man, I don't know, but I'm like, it felt like what would happen to me. And so I addressed that, and this reader felt I had addressed it sufficiently by being clear about the shame he felt that this was the reaction he had had. Like a young woman who all his life he had thought of as kind of like a niece, shows up looking like a completely different person and he has this reaction. But it's I think those moral fallings down of the people who are supposed to be the good guys are just as interesting as when you get this glimmer from the bad guys of why they're doing what they're doing. You were like, oh, yeah, I can understand why they're doing that.
Interestingly, I beta read a book and was asked my opinion. And the main character, who is the hero, the good guy, he just kept talking about this woman's breasts. And I was like, you really can't do that if you want him to be the hero, because they do end up as a couple, but he just seems stalkery and creepy, like, especially to women. You're setting him up to be not liked because it was constant. You know what I mean? It wasn't just one slip up and then him going, oh, I shouldn't be noticing that. And in which case we would actually think better of him because he's showing his humanity, his weakness, but then he's overcoming it.
Yeah.
And so I think that is the fine line of, whereas if he was really the villain, he would just go ahead and show that weakness and he'd never feel bad about it. It would be fine. So I think that is a key for writers, I think, to you can have the villain and you can have a good guy. Both have the same initial response or reaction to a circumstance, but then it's what do they do with that thing, after the fact, what do they do with it? I did think of the classic villain, like one of the best villains out there, Ripley by, Patricia Highsmith. Her original book was The Incredible Mr. Ripley or The Amazing
The
Mr.
talented,
Ripley.
I
The
know that.
Talented.
Yeah.
Yes, it was a good adjective. The
Yeah.
Talented Mr. Ripley
Yeah.
was the first book. The new TV series that just came out, I think it's on Netflix, it's just called Ripley. It's just great. You almost like him. You do kind of like him, but then he's just awful. Everything he
Yeah.
does is awful. And It's just so cleverly done because Patricia Highsmith is a master at that, like Strangers on a Train too.
But I think,
And it's that hollowness that they have, that emptiness that you relate to in the beginning that they're trying to fill, but then the way they fill that hollow emptiness inside of them is like, oh no, you have crossed a line.
yeah, I think that Andrew Scott is the person who plays Ripley, and I think he's also the person who plays Moriarty in the
Yeah, and
Benedict
Sherlock.
Cumberbatch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that was one of those ones that I kind of wish that there was like a setting on the program where I could just see the scenes with Moriarty because he was so much fun to watch. And I think part of the reason that villain was fun was that it was kind of a game to him. It was a competition. It was like a fun competition. Sherlock Holmes thinks he's the best, but I'm really the best. And this is going to be a game where I show him that I'm the best. And I don't know what it was about that it was so fun to watch. I think some of it was just almost the playfulness of it. There's almost a little bit of playfulness in the Hannibal Lecter character too.
Yeah, that he's got a sense of humor.
Yeah, and kind of like having fun with the mental games, mentally playing with somebody else. But yeah, it's
Yeah,
kind of like an unexpected. You don't expect playfulness to be a characteristic of a villain, but it certainly was, at least in the Sherlock show.
I think that's key. What you just said for writing a really good, compelling villain is finding personality traits or aspects or things that are unexpected in a villain. I
Yeah.
think that really can take a villain from sufficient, like this is a good character. It's got all the parts and does the things and fits the story and has the motives and elevates it to the next level is when that character becomes something that is really unexpected that you just don't expect to see in a villain. Like you don't expect to see compassion or you don't expect to see humor or you don't expect to see that playfulness or whatever the thing is.
Yeah.
I think that can really elevate. And I know I'm sure I haven't always done that. But it's something to think about.
Yeah. Well, I did have one last question, which was that you were talking about some of the changes you were making with what was the 7 deadly sins. And I'm wondering, so do you have a consistent villain through those?
No.
The
So
villains are different in each one.
yes. So what I've added into the new series, the change, is actually a podcaster. So each book is now a season of this podcaster's true crime podcast.
That's so cool.
So I am having fun with her, and so uh, she introduces the book, the season, and then depending on how the book goes, every 6 or 7 chapters, that's a wrap to an episode. And so she'll come in and wrap it up and ask a question of the week that is on her Facebook group, which somebody asked me, are you going to do that? And I'm like, I don't know how I would because people are going to be reading the books at all different times. And then she talks about her listeners. And then somewhere along the line, I got this idea that one of her listeners sends her an email and asks her, so how did you get into all this crime stuff? It's just not pleasant. Like, why did you go down this investigative journalism career path? And she tells a story about how her college roommate went out to the bar one night and never came back. She was a missing person, and that really rocked her world, and it made her change her career path and decide to go down this investigative journalism. And then her audience starts responding to that, like, oh, they knew some other student at that time who went missing. So there's this crime, this mystery that kind of goes from book to book to book that overarches. And then I'm going to write a book or a novella at the end where she kind of goes off air and solves the crime that was teased and little clues were given throughout the series of books. So, and I already know the villain of that crime. So I'm like,
That is so cool.
it's
I
a
love
lot of
something
fun.
that's that tightly and complexly thought through from an organizational point of view.
Well, I know that I could have done it on the first go round.
Yeah.
The first go round, I wrote the 7 stories, the 7 crimes, and the characters know each other. And actually, the 7th book circles around and deals with characters from the first book and villains from the first book much more closely. So it's a big circle. But I didn't think of the series arc as clearly until I got to about book 3 or 4. And then I was like, oh, should have
Yeah.
a series arc. You know what I mean? That's something to think about. So if you do have different characters and you're linking this world, how are you linking it? And so anyway, it come
Yeah.
up. It's a really great, fun thing that I am able to do this because most authors, once you publish your books, it's sort of a done deal. So the fact that we've taken them all down and I'm redoing them is just, and my publisher wanted to, and all of that is just a huge blessing and a lot of fun. And it's a lot of fun to see your growth as a writer.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have you back on the podcast when all those books come out, so you can talk a little bit about that experience, because that is a super cool story, not one I've heard very often.
No, I know. I feel like Megan said she wants to interview me for our podcast too on the topic. Is it's like I'm gonna have to put all my head together about it so that I don't go blank when people ask me questions, like.
It,
But anyway, it's fun.
cool. Well, Greta, thank you so much for indulging me in the conversation about villains, and please let everybody know where they can go to find out more about you and all your work online.
Sure. So my fiction is gretaboris.com and it's Greta with 1 T and Boris like Boris Karloff. So that's pretty easy. gretaboris.com. And I do have a free novella and the Mortician series available on my website that you can grab. And then for my nonfiction stuff, it's all at authorwheel.com. Author Wheel is the podcast name. It's also the website name. And we have some freebies over there too. We have a 7-day free mini course called 7 Days to Clarity, Uncover Your Author Purpose, which kind of delves into who are you as a writer? Why do you write what you write? And leads you through creating an author mission statement and tagline. So that's available there too.
Yeah, and we just episode 242 was uncovering your author purpose, so people could go there, get a little like teaser from the podcast episode, then they're going to want to go and sign up for the full course.
Yes, that would be awesome. Yeah, I remember that was a fun conversation.
That was a fun conversation. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, Maddie, for having me on. It was great.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Greta. Who is your favorite fictional villain and what makes them your favorite? You can even nominate your own villains. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube, and while you're at it, please subscribe. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Maddie a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.